Hello, hello, I am Joe the Science Bro, and this is Science Talk. As we have been continuing on this journey together, we have been talking about multiple different topics in science and in the literature that currently exists. I am grateful today that we are able to have back our only returning guest at this point. But I'm very grateful that he is, as always, able to give us some of his time and also able to share with us the perspective and the knowledge that he has. So please join me, as always, in welcoming back Dr. Brian Balin. Dr. Balin, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's my pleasure and our pleasure to have you. How have you been, Dr. Balin, since we've seen you last? It has been a little bit of a bit of time.
Doing well. It's never a dull day around here. As an academic scientist, we go from one thing to the other, anywhere from teaching to being in the lab,
right,
to writing papers, reviewing, working on collaborations, et cetera, et cetera. So
yeah.
It's constant.
Yes. It never ends.
Right.
But then that's part of the fun, isn't it?
Right. Absolutely.
No, that's some of the best parts about being involved in science is that it's, even though it's very monotonous at times, it almost seems like every single day is something different.
Yes, it's almost as if, if you go online and you have feeds of science coming in, you'll see something every day. It's something different, something new, something improved. Something that is coming to us that we don't even necessarily expect. And so it keeps us thinking all the time about the different aspects of science, and there are so many different aspects.
There always is. It always seems like it's ever evolving, ever changing, adapting probably is the better way of putting it. So today, Dr. Balin, I would think that it would be a good idea for us to start discussing some of the different types of dementia. I mean, in the past, we've discussed Alzheimer's a lot, and I'd like to touch on Alzheimer's a little bit more today, but also there are different types of dementias. Can you give us an idea of just how many different types of dementias there are in brief?
Yes. There are quite a few types of dementias, and typically we define the dementias based on a lot of the symptomatology you see with a dementing process. And when we talk about neurodegenerative processes, typically of older individuals, sometimes it could be younger as well, we think of those types of processes leading to a chronic problem, which often is described as dementia.
Yeah.
Dementia has a very negative connotation to it because it seems like if someone is called or termed as demented or having a dementia, we think of that, oh my God, they no longer can think properly, act properly, behave properly, etc.
Right.
That isn't necessarily the case. There are many different types of symptoms that come along with a dementia. In fact, the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual of the 5th edition that came out in 2013 started defining dementias as more as neurocognitive disorders of different severities and different levels, where different aspects of the symptoms as they start to increase gives you more and more severe neurocognitive deficits. And those deficits can be a wide variety of things.
Yeah.
So of all these different types of dementias, you could, for instance, I'll give some examples. You could have vascular dementia, which is primarily a vascular problem in the brain, leading to the inability to think and cognate properly. It can affect behavior, it can affect sleep, it can affect attention, etc. Many other dementias too are like that, and giving you similar symptomatology. So in the analysis of a dementia, you have to go through different levels of testing and looking for different problems.
Yeah.
But there's also frontotemporal dementias, there's Lewy body dementia, there are obviously Alzheimer's dementia, there can be dementia with Parkinson's disease, there can be dementia with ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease,
right.
amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. For instance, about 40% of the individuals with ALS also have a dementia, which is now of the cortical areas of the brain,
Right.
for instance, the higher level areas of the brain as well. So there are all these different types, and we typically use symptomatology to help us define that. However, the only way of truly knowing and putting this into proper perspective and classifying the dementia and correlating it to the symptomatology is with post-mortem evaluation of brain tissues. And you're looking for different types of pathologies in different regions of the brain. Now, sometimes you can use imaging such as MRIs or CAT scans, or even positron emission tomography, PET scanning, to give you indications of the particular type of dementia that an individual has, along with the symptomatology. So you can get better clarification that way, but often you still have to look at a post-mortem tissue to have the definitive diagnosis.
Yeah. So you mentioned Parkinson's and ALS. Could you elaborate a little bit more on ALS? Because if I remember correctly, ALS as we know it today and Lou Gehrig's disease as we knew it then are two different things, if I'm not mistaken. So
well, there's what's interesting with ALS. So principally, it's affecting the motor neurons in parts of the spinal cord, so that now you're losing motor functioning and coordination, things of that nature, due to damage and actually death of these certain motor neurons. What has been found is that there's a percentage, very low percentage of individuals that have genetic mutations in certain genes that can lead to ALS. And this is more of a hereditary form of ALS as well. So this could be passed along to progeny of an individual that has this, if it's familial or genetic or what we call hereditary. It's a small percentage. There's a larger percentage actually that is what we call sporadic ALS, where we don't know why someone is also having damage and death of those particular neurons, again in the same region of the spinal cord. Now, in some individuals, you also get very similar pathology in the frontal and temporal regions of the brain. And this type of pathology is very similar to what you would find in ALS. And we try to understand that bridge there of why two different regions of the central nervous system really are demonstrating this pathology and why this is occurring. And we really don't know, other than the fact that the pathological entities appear to be comparable in those regions. For instance, there's a TDP43 protein that starts to accumulate in the nucleus and at times in the cytoplasm of neuronal cells in both regions. You can find other types of pathology too, but that's some of the main pathology that you would find. That particular protein is involved with nucleic acid transcription, those particular things where you're actually now controlling the genetics of the cell.
Yeah.
And why that's happening, we're not sure. Other types of issues that happen with ALS. You can have now those genetic mutations of what we call superoxide dismutase.
Okay.
The gene for superoxide dismutase. This is the copper zinc form of superoxide dismutase. You have a couple of different forms.
Okay.
And if you have mutations of that, what it means is that it's a gene that codes for an enzyme that actually detoxifies any kinds of free radical, oxygen-free radicals that could occur inside of a cell. And these free radicals occur when you have metabolism. You can generate free radicals. So our cells are designed and our bodies are designed to try to eliminate those free radicals by having certain proteins that can actually bind those up and lead to a detoxification event. If you can't do that, these free radicals then can accumulate inside of our cells and damage DNA, RNA, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates. So they can bind onto any of these ingredients and damage the cell and eventually kill the cell. So that's a big problem.
So it sounds as though a lot of what you're talking about is that it's not necessarily a dysfunction of the molecule itself causing the damage, but it's a later stage product from that damaged molecule that is causing the issue.
Yes. So if we think of it this way, that if you now have metabolism ongoing in a cell and you can't control the byproducts of metabolism, and sometimes they're toxic molecules, if you can't detoxify those, the cell then is subject to undergoing damage.
Yeah.
And if it's severe enough, the cell may actually die. And so what we find with ALS is you find these particular cells, these motor neurons, in the it's the lateral regions of the spinal cord. They actually die, and now you're losing functionality. And in the brain proper as well, so in the cortical regions of the brain, if you start to damage those cells as well, now you can start to develop levels of dementia, in essence, where you have enough neurodegeneration that you're affecting cognitive abilities, executive planning, attentionality, or being able to attend to certain aspects of your daily life. Personality could be affected. You can affect, also, it depends on the extent of damage in these areas and where it's happening. You could affect speech. You could affect language centers. You could affect many different regions here that control a lot of the basic functionality that we have.
So just for reference and for everyone that is in our audience, in the most basic sense, unlike what we always see in movies and TV, dementia is not solely a destruction of the personality or destruction of the memory process, but it can also be it's not necessarily the loss of memory, but it's the loss of the cognitive ability of basically putting A plus B equaling C all together. And it also seems as though it's much more of a complicated system than just I'm sitting on the couch because I can't remember what I'm supposed to be doing.
Correct. And the different dementias will have predilections for different types of functionality that now is impacted.
So we actually do have our very first question.
Okay.
What area or areas of the body clean out those free radicals that you were discussing earlier?
Okay, so those free radicals are generated in all of our cells, actually, with metabolism. So in our cells, we have molecules that will reduce the free radical so that it now is not active. Basically, it's binding onto the electrons of the molecule and now neutralizing. Okay, so we make things like glutathione, we make catalase, we make peroxidases, we have superoxide dismutases. These are all different types of enzymes and molecules that will now take those free radicals. And typically they're oxygen free radicals like superoxide or hydroxyl radicals. Sometimes even nitrogen radicals can evolve. And so you could get reactive nitrogen species, they're called. So these elements take those and bind onto them when they're made, typically. So it's a constant balance, actually. It's that homeostatic balance. So during metabolism, when we're actively breaking down food molecules, glucose, and we're going into the citric acid cycle, and we're now going to make ATP in our mitochondria, and we're going to reduce oxygen to water, you also are going to create radicals along the way. And in doing so, these other ingredients will bind onto those so they don't damage anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's the normal. But when that gets out of balance, now you have a real problem, because if you don't have these particular ingredients of what I've mentioned to bind onto these free radicals, they will start binding quickly to all these ingredients in a cell.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on how much are made, will depend then on how the cell is damaged or not.
So these reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species, do these just get caused because you're thinking too hard, you're being way too active, or is this something that can happen spontaneously, or is this a genetic factor that happens?
These are actually things that happen normally,
Mm-hmm.
and with increased activity, you can create more.
Mm.
That's correct. So, for instance, if you're out exercising a lot, your cells are working harder.
Yeah.
They actually could be generating more free radicals, but at the same time, you're balancing out the generation of free radicals with modulating them, binding on, denaturing them, basically.
Yeah.
So that should all be normal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're over exercising, if you go to a level where you now have gone beyond the ability of cells to maintain that homeostatic balance,
Mm-hmm.
you could actually start to damage cells.
Yeah.
You could get a breakdown of certain cells. Like if you over exercise and you now have muscle changes,
Mm-hmm.
you could potentially, it could be demonstrated that a myoglobin all of a sudden
Right.
gets released from muscle cells into the bloodstream, can show up in the urine even.
Mm.
Okay, well that's demonstrating that something has gone to the excess.
Right.
Now, drugs can do that too. For instance, certain statin drugs lead to breakdown of muscle and the release of myoglobin into the bloodstream, and lead to achiness at levels of pain, fatigue, etc. because of that happening. So there's different things that could lead to something of that happening. But a lot of that is also generating now a potential for free radicals now to be damaging the cells so that they're now dysfunctional.
Mm. So, in terms of this dysfunction, again, I want to touch on this. Is this something that is sporadic that happens, or is this you have to have a genetic predisposition for?
That's a really good question. It could be both, actually, and this is why certain genetic diseases could lead to this outcome,
Mm-hmm.
where you do have mutations of genes, so they no longer function properly to make
Right.
keep that balance. And you can have a lot of these diseases are sporadic, especially your neurodegenerative diseases. A lot of those actually are what we term more sporadic than genetic.
Mm.
Meaning, we don't know, there's no real genetic mutation that's been identified. There is genetic risk, as we would have with any disease,
Mm-hmm.
but there's no specific gene mutation that's leading to the problem. Without that, we term it more sporadic, where we think there's more of an environmental insult or insults that can now actually influence how our cells are functioning.
Yeah.
So that could be almost any disease entity in the body where you could find that.
So in terms of dementia, what's the difference between, let's say, a frontotemporal and a vascular dementia?
Okay, if we go by symptomatology, what's interesting there is frontotemporal dementia actually is affecting the frontal and temporal parts of the brain. And I'm going to show you an example of this by holding this up. This
Dr. Balin has props this week, everyone.
It is a schematic of the brain here. This is the frontal part of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the temporal part of the brain. So the cells in this part of the brain and in this part of the brain actually can be affected in frontotemporal dementia.
Mm.
That's why it's named that. Okay, so you're now damaging cells in this region.
Right.
If you had a vascular issue, the vascular issue could damage other parts of the brain, including parts in here as well, but could damage many different parts. It could damage areas back in here or back in here, This is be the occipital, where you have vision recognition. Up in here, parietal, where you have now issues with spatial orientation. You have issues. Part of it down in here would be with language comprehension, Wernicke's area. You also have other areas in the parietal for musical abilities, some levels of language and more expression language, math ability, things of that nature. So there's many different types of functionality.
Right.
Okay. So if it's a vascular issue, you could have many, many different types of insults showing up that would lead to a dementia that could involve many of these regions. With frontotemporal, you're actually now involving more of areas here where you'd have now executive planning, you have personality, you have some behavioral issues, but in temporal as well, and some emotional issues. So you can have a wide range fluctuation of symptoms. Also with frontotemporal, which is interesting, you can affect the language center. So over in here is Broca's area, back in here is Wernicke's area, and these things are connected. There's fiber tracts that connect them, and you can start to affect language. Okay, so this is where if people have primary progressive aphasia, for instance, that has been brought up recently with the Bruce Willis issue, that he's becoming aphasic. Okay, well, that's a primary progressive aphasia, meaning there's neurodegeneration. Nerve cells are being lost in areas for language. Now, it can be for language comprehension, expression of language, understanding language. It could also involve now the fluency of language, where you are not being able to actually speak very fluently. It is now not coming out. It's sort of like a stuttering of words where you didn't stutter before.
Yeah.
Where now it's just not, you're not able to formulate your verbal language. Put it that way.
Is it that the signal is getting through, or is it that the signal is trying to get through and it's trying so hard that it's overcompensating?
The signals actually are being lost, so that you're not communicating now with other parts of the body to actually be able to express the language, verbally express. You may understand still, if you don't have damage in Wernicke's area, for instance, you may be able to understand it, but now you're trying to express yourself, you're having a difficult time doing that. That's what we call more of like a non-fluent aphasia.
Okay.
Versus a fluent aphasia, where you could speak fine, but if you have damage in your language comprehension centers and being able to now put comprehensible words together, your language may be coming out where you think you're saying something that makes sense and it's complete nonsense, but you're able to verbalize it fine.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So how do we figure out which type of dementia someone actually has? You know, I mean, I already have an idea of this answer because obviously, you know, I work with you on some of these topics, but is there some symptoms that are indicative of specific dementias? Is there blood tests that we can do? You know, you talked about MRI and PET scans earlier.
Yes, we would use those approaches. We could do some level of blood testing, looking for some elements of nerve cells that, once the nerve cell is damaged, is leaching into the cerebral spinal fluid, eventually into the blood. At times it's difficult to make those correlations, though, from what you're finding in a blood sample to the particular type of dementia. So often we go to either neuropsychological testing, which is a component. We also go to the symptomatology. What are the symptoms? A perfect example, going back to another type of dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies. This is one where the protein called alpha-synuclein starts to accumulate in cell bodies. And it's demonstrated this is a type of pathology that accumulates in this disease. Well, dementia with Lewy bodies is interesting because you can start to get all kinds of symptomatology, but there are a couple that actually become very prominent And you use that as being like a signpost that it most likely is this type of dementia. Perfect example of this with dementia of Lewy bodies is visual hallucinations actually becomes a prominent symptom in that disease.
Interesting.
Also, inability to have attention. So a person does not maintain their attention span very long. They're going from one thing to the other. They can also demonstrate changes with executive planning, for instance, or inability to solve a very simple problem. Personality changes. They may get angry very quickly. They may have outbursts. So you look for certain signs like that, and then you start to assign, well, it's most likely this type of dementia, based on a lot of that symptomatology, neuropsych testing, etc.
Seems very subjective in nature rather than objective, which is what we're used to in modern medical diagnoses.
Right, and part of that is because you have multiple areas of the brain being affected in many of these different types of dementias, and multiple different types of pathologies. So different types of nerve cells are being lost in different regions. And from one person to the next, there may be consistency with certain symptoms. For instance, with Alzheimer's disease, often the first symptoms show up that you have an issue with smell identification and also with short-term memory. And those are severely affected early on. Typically, those are really common symptoms that would show up in that disease for the most part. And then it can lead to some levels of personality change, emotionality change, and all of this is because of different regions of the brain being affected. So as it progresses, you can now start to see that there are different symptoms that would arise as well. But some of these early symptoms, like Parkinson's disease, for instance, Parkinson's disease, typically we think of as a motor disease.
Right.
Parkinson's, about 50% of the people with Parkinson's also have what we would term a dementia.
Interesting.
And we think it's because other cells in the cerebral cortical regions are being affected. Parkinson's principally will start with deficits in the midbrain regions, the substantia nigra, and that is involved with motor ability. So a person there may show up with motor deficit, with the motor input to different regions of the body is affected. Shuffling gait is a symptomatology. What we call mask-like faces, where you're losing the ability to express in your face.
Right.
Also, the pill rolling effect, where at rest you're tremoring, yes, and it looks like you're rolling a pill like this at rest when you're not having any type of purposeful movement.
Isn't there also what do we call it? The Parkinson's lean, because of the center of balance being off.
Yes. Often individuals will lean forward. As if, because they can't balance, they feel like they're going to fall.
Right.
So they lean forward. They're walking as if they are leaning that way.
Yeah.
And often shuffling. So that you're not picking your feet up. You're moving them, shuffling them along.
Yeah.
And then with the dementia part of that too, then all of a sudden now an individual may demonstrate that they have a memory issue, or that they can't figure out a very simple problem that they used to be able to do, or an activity of daily living is being now challenging, like how to turn the stove on, for instance. They may not, it may not be there anymore in their cognitive ability.
What age are we talking about here? Are we talking about like 80s and 90s, or are we talking about 70s and 60s, 50s, 40s? Where are we in terms of dementia? Really?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question, because most of the dementias that we think about are of older age. And typically we use a cutoff about 65. I don't know, it's almost as if, well, that's when typical retirement age, and beyond that, oh my God, we can now have dementia. Well, in some ways that's artificial. And I say that because, for instance, frontotemporal dementias, The age range for that occurring is between 40 to 65.
Jeez.
So you could be pretty young and all of a sudden start to develop a symptomatology of a frontotemporal dementia. In Alzheimer's disease, if you have the genetic form of Alzheimer's disease, which fortunately is the minor component of all of Alzheimer's, that can actually begin in the 30s.
Wow.
There are individuals that actually started in their mid-30s showing symptomatology of Alzheimer's. There have been some reports in the literature suggesting that Alzheimer's even could show up even younger than that. But
Really?
we're not sure it's truly Alzheimer's disease at that point in time. So most of the time we think of Alzheimer's disease, for instance, as being over the age of 65, the older population, and that's the vast majority of people that do get it are pretty old. 70s, 80s, 90s, even into the hundreds. There are a lot of people, though, that are now growing quite old. The centenarian population is growing more and more, and we're finding that there are a lot of centenarians that do not have dementia. They're neurocognitively intact when you measure. So we know this isn't a total eventuality for everyone, that you can live into very much long old age and still be quite mentally intact and not have a dementia. Thank goodness.
Has anything been attributed to that longevity of the cognition?
Well, you know, for the most part, it's been attributed to lifestyle.
Interesting.
Lifestyle and a level of genetics, but specific genetics is where the question mark is variable.
I know you and I have discussed multiple times, about how remaining active can do wonders for someone who is in the retirement period, if you will. Gardening, cleaning up the yard, taking walks. Walking the dog, or even just having an animal can keep someone active and move them up and down. I guess one of the things, at least, we've talked about it in the past, is when someone starts to become purely sedentary, it seems as though their health starts to take a decline.
Yes, it seems to be the case. And you're right, the exercise, the movements are keeping the body in a better balance.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of that is ability to oxygenate different organ sites in the body, the brain being a key one.
Yeah.
The brain at any one time is using 20% of our oxygen load in the body. It needs to have that. And the better the blood flow into the brain, which contains by the way, if you stretch the vessels in the brain into one long line, it stretches out to be about 500 miles long of blood vessels. Okay. So to keep oxygenation there in the brain is really important to many different regions. So that is a big key. Now, it's not preventive, but it can help to modulate the risk of going on to have something else happen in the body now, or in the brain. In this case, that movement is really good. The movement also helps your immune system. Okay, and getting out and walking and staying active actually helps maintain a more potent, I would say, immune system. Your diet will also do that. Yeah. So the diet also is very important in that, especially if you have more so of a Mediterranean diet of fish and olive oil and nuts and fruits.
That reminds me, there was actually a recent article that came out, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, that was actually showing that the Mediterranean diet had a much more beneficial effect on the human immune system.
Yeah, and because of the ingredients that you have in the Mediterranean diet, really help the body to maintain that homeostatic balance.
Wow.
And it may also influence what our gut microbiota is doing. So the gut microbiome is a key to staying healthy as well, so that you have the proper organisms digesting certain foods the right way, leading to ingredients, metabolic byproducts, like butyrate, for instance, which is really healthy for you in the gut. Okay, so we have organisms that actually digest certain foods into these ingredients that actually keep us healthier for our cellular health.
Yeah.
And that's not only gut health, but systemic health, which can also influence brain health.
So another question for you. So if a parent or grandparent has had dementia, is there a higher chance that the offspring is going to have dementia, or is it going to skip a generation, or is this really that kind of inheritance only found in the familial form?
Really, we focus in on the familial form of these different types of dementias as being the risk for the next generation.
Right.
So
and that's the genetic form.
These are genetic forms. That's correct. Now, those would be more in genetic mutations for that hereditary forms, and we can't do much about that.
Yeah.
There are also genetic risk factors, like the ApoE epsilon 4. It's the apolipoprotein that moves high-density lipoproteins, low-density lipoproteins around our bodies. If you have certain forms of that, it increases risk. If you have the ApoE4 homozygous E4E4 versus E4E3 or E4E2, the E4E4 gives you about 11 times risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. But there are individuals with E4E4 allelic genotype that do not get the disease.
Even I'm getting confused with all the E's getting thrown around. Could you describe that a little bit more for us?
Okay, so this is a gene that all of our genes have two alleles to them.
Yes.
And one of the two alleles is expressed typically, okay? So if you have two alleles that are apolipoprotein E4, that means that one of them will be expressed, you'll have an E4 expression.
Right.
Okay. When you have that expression, it's increasing risk for certain diseases. So what's interesting here, it increases risk for Alzheimer's disease, but it also increases infective risk. Like if you have this, you have you're more likely to be infected with certain viruses, like hepatitis B and hepatitis C. Even HIV can use that particular molecule when it's made in our bodies for infectivity into cells. So that's an interesting sideline with what that particular molecule can do. Now, if you are, let's go back to the genes a moment. Okay, so if your genes are an E3, if you have a gene for the apolipoprotein, but you have an E3 allele and an E4 allele, maybe one came from the mother, one came from the father, mixed this way, that still increases your risk if the E4 allele is expressed, but the E3 allele could be expressed and the E4 is quiet.
Interesting.
So now people with E3 alleles and then making the apolipoprotein E3 can still get Alzheimer's disease. There's plenty of people that have that also, that get Alzheimer's disease. So we know it's not purely based on this type of genetic risk.
Yeah.
But there's some involvement with these genes, this particular gene, with increasing risk or decreasing risk. For instance, if you're E2, it actually decreases your risk for Alzheimer's disease. It's almost protective.
That's very confusing.
It is.
Especially, not just for us as scientists, but even for doctors. That has to be extremely confusing, especially in the diagnostic aspect.
It is, and it's probably how these particular molecules are actually working, not only as molecules that bind onto your lipids, your high density or low density lipoproteins that are in that we all make, but also how they may act in addition to that. And in some ways they may be protective. So we're still trying to uncover specifics to these types of proteins, these genes and proteins, as to why that one set could be preventive and the other set is giving you risk.
Interesting. So would you be able to test for these specific molecules in a young person and then prepare them in a way so that they will be able to almost, how can I put it, reduce or extend their period of time where they won't have this cognitive decline?
Well, if it's you can test genetically almost anyone, okay, to see if you have the particular mutations of genes that have been correlated to certain diseases. In this case, it would be Alzheimer's disease, for instance. There are some genes also like this for Parkinson's disease, for ALS, etc. So a number of neurodegenerative diseases do have those genetic components where you have gene mutations, and you can test for those. You can also test for the risk factor genes if they've been identified. So, for instance, you could test someone to see if they have the ApoE4 or ApoE epsilon 4 allelic genotype. Now, the problem with that is that when you do that and you tell somebody they have now a gene that could increase their risk for Alzheimer's disease, what do they do with that information? We don't know how to minimize how it would be a risk factor for a person going on to develop Alzheimer's disease. So we don't know what to do with that information at this point in time.
So there's still a lot of unknowns about dementia as a whole, not just Alzheimer's, Lewy body, frontotemporal, or vascular. Right. There's just so many unknowns in dementia in general.
Yes, there are. And that makes it difficult for us to really figure out what the problem is. Is what's creating the pathology, what's stimulating the cells to change to now leading to this type of pathology. And many of us have, we've moved backwards. We're trying to focus on that now. What are the insults that could lead to this? That's why, as we've talked many times, we're studying infection as a potential insult for this. But there could be toxins that could be an insult for this. There could be trauma that's an insult for this. There could be premorbid or conditions that you might have on board that could be. For instance, somebody with diabetes and you're not utilizing glucose properly could also be adding to that risk. Okay, so and leading to now change in cells that could lead to pathology downstream. It may be these multitude of factors. So this is the big puzzle we have, and we're trying to figure it out for each one of these dementias, but also in general of why is the brain being affected in these different ways.
Yeah. So let me throw another monkey wrench into this conversation, make it a little bit more complicated. What is the difference? What is MCI, number one? I already know, obviously, it's mild cognitive impairment.
Yes.
And what is the difference between mildly cognitively impaired and demented?
Okay, so mildly cognitively impaired actually is now picking out a particular deficit where someone is having a problem in one facet of their cognitive ability. If it's amnestic, where memory is involved, it is thought that individual is showing now a level of change that could go on to be Alzheimer's disease and diagnosed that way. But there's many mild cognitively impaired individuals that don't have memory as an issue. So those individuals may have a deficit that is very specific and not even progressive. So they may just have an inability now to perform a particular task, like being able to divide in a math equation, okay, or an inability to have a particular type of executive planning. They may struggle with that, okay, but it's something that's very well defined. And it's not associated with other symptomatology. So that's what we would call as mild cognitively impaired. And then it's hard to predict how they will now either stay stable or progress. Now, some of those people can actually even improve depending on what the deficit is.
Interesting.
Because For instance, if the deficit was due to, let's say it's a microinfarct where you have like a mini stroke in the brain, and over time you now have therapy that actually now is allowing you to regain functionality that may have been lost to a very particular area of the brain, leading to a very particular deficit. So you may be able to now regain levels of functionality.
That was actually going to be one of my next questions was, can you remain mildly cognitive impaired almost permanently? So you don't necessarily progress towards dementia or Alzheimer's or somewhere farther, but you remain almost stagnant.
The thought is, at this point in time, yes, you could remain at a level of that nature.
And someone with MCI can lead a completely normal life.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, even some of these dementias with the early diagnosis, individuals still maintain high levels of functionality.
Yeah.
Because these are progressive processes. It's not as if everything hits at one time and you've lost everything at one time. It progresses. And the level of progression and rate of progression can be different for the different individuals. Some individuals, you may have very fast progression. Other individuals, it could take decades to progress to an endpoint where the endpoint is severe dementia, inability to really function, even maybe go into a vegetative state. But it literally could take 20 years from the time of diagnosis to that outcome.
So let me ask you this question, because this is probably something that's on everybody's mind throughout the entirety of the United States when it comes to Alzheimer's or dementia in general. Should a patient be afraid of that diagnosis, or should they be afraid of the diagnostic process in terms of that kind of diagnosis? Because, we've talked about, especially in previous episodes, we've talked about how the vocabulary of that diagnosis can in and of itself be a difficulty for the patient.
Yes. Well, and this is where the connotation of what these words mean and what it means to an individual and it means to any of us.
Right.
Because at times when you hear that someone is demented, if you're not aware of what that really means and the level of that dementia, individuals will have a very, at times, dramatic response to that. They may not want to engage with the individual.
Right.
The individual that has that diagnosis may also feel like I don't want to engage with anyone else because I'm not going to be able to function in a normal way. I'm going to be struggling. I'm going to be put into a position of stress in my environment because of how the interactions would be socially. So there you get social isolation. Social isolation actually is negative. It is a bad thing to go into, actually. You want to be socialized. You want to socialization at its max because that can actually help. It can help maintain.
It's funny that you bring that up because if I'm not mistaken, and I forget the country that it's in, it's one of the Nordic countries if I'm not mistaken, there's actually a community that is there where college students and college-age students are able to live at either a reduced rate or completely free, but there is a requirement that they actually must interact with the Alzheimer's and elderly community that lives in the same building. And what they've seen is that not only are the younger people learning specific things that they wouldn't normally learn because of whatever reason, whether it be upbringing, the community that they grew up in, or just lack of that particular technology, but they're also seeing that the patients with Alzheimer's and dementia are actually having, I don't want to say it's a reverse of symptoms, but they're having these moments where it's like the symptoms aren't as bad.
Yeah, and you make a good point there, because with engagement, younger people, even older people, of socialization, what it does is it makes you have to actually now do something active. When you keep your brain active, it keeps, the neurons keep interacting. They keep sending out signals. You still have abilities to do things.
Yeah.
If you stop doing that, it would be like, for example, if you stopped communicating with someone and you said, okay, I'm afraid to communicate, I'm not going to engage, and you stop talking to someone, all of a sudden, if you continue doing that, it's going to be harder and harder from that point on to actually then engage in a verbal way because you're now shutting off your processing. You're shutting off the ability to do it. So it's almost like it's the use it or lose it type of process. And that's where you have to keep using. You're using the brain because some things are hardwired in the brain. Those where like the optic nerve is hardwired. Our olfactory, and other cranial nerves like optic, olfactory, vagal nerve. The different cranial nerves are hardwired, and we need to use those. And some of those can be used in a very voluntarily. Can be used. We'll put it that way. You can. It's like you have to open your eyes to be able to see. Okay, so if you open your eyes, keep your eyes open. You're going to now have that input coming in. If you're speaking, you're going to be moving your tongue and your mouth, and you're going to be using now the hypoglossal nerve. Okay, you keep these things hardwired. You keep them active. It also goes to thought processes. How are your thoughts being formulated? How are they being expressed? If you stop doing it, you're going to find it more difficult to pick it up again. And so this is why you need to have that level of activity, brain activities, doing puzzles, doing word games, even just, simple things as well, are all helpful to keep those abilities there.
So So 2 questions. The first of which is, how important is a daily routine, like getting up, doing things in a specific rhythm, in a specific way, at specific times? How important is that to someone with dementia, Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment? Is that going to assist in maintenance of their cognitive abilities, or is that going to be more along the lines of easier for their brain to go on autopilot, if you will?
I think the answer to that would be that it will actually help if you have a routine, because now the planning is there.
Yes,
you're actually now actually stretching, I guess, their ability to maintain a plan and focus in on a plan. And what is the plan? Well, if you have a routine that at 6 o'clock every evening you're going to go to dinner, that's where the memory will be implanted, basically, in the individual, so that now it becomes more of a rote thing of, oh, it's 6 o'clock, I have to go to dinner.
Almost like they associate the ringing of the clock at 6 o'clock with it's time for me to go to dinner.
Correct.
I see.
So in some ways, that's really helpful because it keeps them in touch. And a recognition of that at this point in time I'm doing the following.
Right.
If you go into more of a random type of an approach, that isn't as they've lost the synchronicity of that activity, and then it becomes more random even for them. They're not sure what to do. It's, well, what do I do now? Am I supposed to go to dinner? Am I supposed to go take a walk? Am I supposed to go to the
Come on, Dr. Balin, I have those problems already. Don't scare me like this.
That's because you're multitasking.
Yes, that is very true. There's a ton of things that I'm thinking about at any one moment. That's why my wife, every once in a while, before I have the phone that I have, she used to shove paper and pen in my hand. She'd be like, "Just get the idea out."
Yeah, right. Good point.
So I know that some. I almost want to say that these communities are kind of going overkill in the United States, but I'm seeing them almost like create mini towns. Where there's a general store, there's a barber shop, there's a vet shop, a park, all these different places. is that actually beneficial, or is it more beneficial that they themselves are experiencing the activity more? Is it the activity, or is it the small town aspect that's more beneficial?
Well, some of it's both, actually. I think. I think the activity is important to do and to be maintained.
Yes.
The environment, I think, is important to be reassuring that there's something that is stable and something familiar.
Yeah.
That helps also reinforce the level of calmness in the individual, because they will feel that I know my environment. It's consistent from day to day. It's not changing.
Yeah.
I can adjust to that and feel comfortable with it. If you don't have that consistency, I think there's a panicky type of approach that a person will take to where are they? I don't recognize things. This makes me afraid.
Yeah.
I'm in limbo. I'm in lost. I
Right.
don't know how to interact. I don't know how to be in that particular place. Okay. Obviously, if you in different individuals, as they start to have more neurodegeneration in their brains, they can experience that. Okay, so a person walks outside of their house, they walk down the street, all of a sudden they're lost. They don't know how to get back again.
Right.
Okay, and that's because nerve cells have been damaged to a point where you don't have the recognition again of spatial awareness. Okay, so these types of things where you're putting in place things that are very constant and steady will help it not necessarily regain the ability to have spatial awareness, but it will help them sort of orient to where they are.
Yeah. You had mentioned puzzles and Sudoku, crosswords, things like that. I want to thank one of our audience members because she had the same idea that I did, which is, we have today in this modern era, we have puzzle games that are both physical and digital. Now we even have VR and even augmented reality as well. What benefit is there to each one of those? I mean, the physical obviously gives you, the tactile response, but, for like a computer game, a lot of these games are labeled as puzzle games.
Yes.
Are they helpful to people?
What's interesting is I think they are helpful, but the puzzles of doing puzzles and even mental acuity tasks, things of that nature, don't seem to be as helpful for an individual that actually has started into the dementia realm as or even pre-dementia to keep them from becoming demented,
right,
as exercise, which is interesting. Because we always thought that, okay, well, if you're keeping your brain active and you're now doing higher level thinking and manipulation, for instance, that your brain would now be accommodating and it's helpful for maintaining your status, your cognitive status. But what's interesting is it doesn't seem to be at a level that exercise is in preventing onset, which is sort of counterintuitive that would be the case. But so it's the exercise, the movements, and that goes to more of the blood flowing and oxygenation, glucose delivery, the keeping your metabolism more in sync, I think, overall in the brain than it does to actually doing a particular task where the brain is being active. Both, I think, would be the best approach to take, so that keep thinking in and stretching your mind to actually try to even maintain complex thought. And you can do it with digitally. You can do it with VR as well, where you get now a spatial situation. Maybe you have to act out a certain plan, like going through a maze or something. Right? Where that will help you spatially, but also understanding, well, here's a dead end, I have to go to the left, and the movement around and things of that nature. So there's a lot of different ways that these could be applied.
Yeah.
and be helpful for someone either normally or once they start down the road of dementia to try to like minimize the deficit or try to modulate the deficit.
Could something like AR, which is augmented reality, which could be something as simple as just a small little computer screen embedded in glasses, could that be beneficial to someone with dementia, almost as a way of saying, I don't remember where I am, let me see if I can figure it out? Would that be beneficial to them in some way, shape, or form?
Well, it could. If you had a way of, for instance, if someone is using glasses or hearing, and they're now in an environment, if they start to move in the wrong direction, but now they're given a directional signal.
Yep.
No, you're moving to the right, you need to move to the left, or you need to go to this event. That it's the reminder as they're doing it, so that once they start the process, if they don't have the reminder, they may forget along the way or get lost along the way. But if they have now a recurrent, like an update, okay, you've gone 20 steps, I'm going to update now where you are and where you should be. That could be really helpful. So, especially early on with the dementia cases.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because you could go to moderate levels of dementia and still have fairly high functionality. Okay, and being able to understand commands, being able to understand your environment, know who the people are in your environment, etc. Once you go from moderate, though, to more severe, that's where you're starting to lose an enormous amount of ability.
There was a video game system several years ago that came out. It was called the Nintendo Wii. I don't know if you had been very familiar with it, but a lot of retirement homes were buying this, obviously, because it was a very cheap piece of equipment.
Yes.
Not saying that it wasn't, produced properly, but they were buying it. And one of the things that I was seeing on TV and in news was that they were saying that these communities were seeing a much higher activity level in the residents. Could something like that actually be way more beneficial than we actually give it credit for in the medical community and science as well? Because we just look at it as that's just a video game, that's for fun. Are we kind of downplaying these fun activities as just a thing?
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't think we're necessarily downplaying it. I think they could be really helpful because, if you're playing tennis on Wii,
right?
Okay, you're moving. You're actually now doing something constructive, and it has to be a pattern type of activity.
Yeah.
Right. You have to swing the racket toward the ball and hit, and then respond, and so by doing that, you're using mind and body at the same time. Those things can be really helpful, even though it's just a game. It's a fun thing to do. But you're keeping the person active, if they can be active, in a number of different ways, not only physically but mentally as well, because they have to pay attention, they have to attend to what the issue is of here's a ball that's coming out, now I have to swing at that,
right?
And then go back and do something again a different way. So I think all that could be really useful.
I just to have a diversion here from our discussion, I remember my father, before he passed, and right after I had gotten my Nintendo Wii, I was playing bowling, and my father saw me. He thought it was silly at first. Because, again, he remembers Doom, he remembers the Atari,
right.
He remembers things like that. And, he thought it was silly, but then he was like, you know what, let me try it. And, I showed him how to do it. And my father used to, I think he was in a bowling league. I think he and my mother were in a bowling league. Forgive me if I'm wrong. And he went right into the motion instantly. Almost instantaneously, because it was he was doing the familiar action.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of what you were saying, is that this brings the patient into a certain level of familiarity.
Oh, yes.
That could be, in a way, soothing or therapeutic.
Yeah, I think so. And so those types of things can be very helpful. That's why even having visuals that
Yeah.
where you're not necessarily interacting with the visual other than looking at it, like aquariums, seeing fish swim around, okay, or seeing scenes from a field of flowers can actually have an impact on the individual visually, but then mentally as well, because it may bring back memory issues of long ago, even if their short-term memory now is basically shot. So it can actually elicit then responses in the individual that you may not elicit if you don't have that.
Right.
Okay. So it goes to that sensory stimulation that is really helpful.
So what about coloring? Like coloring books, are they helpful for people with dementia, like the act of coloring in a picture? Because that's going to give them, some spatial movement.
Yeah.
It's going to make them actually think about the colors that they should see or they want to see. I know you have it behind you, but I believe was he an artist or was he a dementia patient or a researcher who painted a self-portrait several times?
Yes, William Utermohlen. Utermohlen was his name. He was an artist.
Okay.
And he did his self-portraits from the late 1960s to the mid to late 1990s. And he developed Alzheimer's disease, and it demonstrated through his ability or inability to do the self-portrait on a continual basis.
Yeah.
So in 1967, he had his self-portrait essentially it looked like him. Okay,
Yes.
He had a beard and he looked, quite normal. By the time he started developing Alzheimer's disease, and then it became progressive and more progressive, by the late 1990s, I think it was about 1997, right before he died, he was drawing a self-portrait of, and it looked like just a mass on a page that had no definition to it, that it was even a face.
Right.
So he lost that complete ability. He could not visualize anymore, even in his own mind, to be able to put it onto paper what a face would look like, his own.
So now moving from there, what do you think about the act of coloring and doing something like that? I mean, it seems very juvenile because we associate coloring books with kids, but
I think actually it's probably a good idea. I don't know specifics with that.
Right. I mean,
but
we're
I
not
would
talking
think
about
yeah, because you have to actually look at a figure, or if you have now a coloring book and you have to color things in. Okay, so you're picking out different colors. You're looking at the figures. You're using some type of recognition ability there. If you're now drawing, potentially you can still draw depending on level of deficit. If somebody was an artist, they may still be able to draw pretty well into as they progress in the disease process. But over time, that is even going to be lost if you have a progressive problem. Most of these dementias are progressive things. It's once they've now been diagnosed, that level of progression will begin, and it can be variable. I mentioned frontotemporal dementia earlier. Right. Frontotemporal dementia, for instance, the progression of that is, on average, from diagnosis to endpoint of death. On average, it's about 8 years. But there are people that have gone out 20 years.
Right.
So it depends on the individual and how they have developed the disease. Because we don't really understand causation at this point in time of many of these diseases.
Right.
We don't know, the extent of what is causing it, leading in and pushing the progression faster or slower.
So it seems, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though Alzheimer's disease and dementia in general is, it's not so simple.
No.
It is difficult to characterize. It is difficult to measure the symptoms. It is difficult to measure the pathology, obviously, because you and I, that's what we're doing.
Yes.
It is difficult to assess the causative actions. It seems like this is such a complex problem. So why I mean, you've talked about Occam's razor in the past. Why isn't there a simple solution yet?
Well,
I warned you I wasn't going to,
Unfortunately, there is no simple solution in the sense that these are chronic processes. Mm-hmm. So dementia is considered to be a chronic type of process, right. A progressiveness to the disease entity, etc. We don't understand what's happening prior to dementia well enough to then understand when it begins, what's really happened up front.
Yeah,
it could be decades before that a process has begun and that gets manifest then in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And we don't understand that yet. But we have, that's why many of us think that environmental aspects of our biology are very important, because what's in our environment and what impact is it having on us at any point in time that could then influence what we become later on in time. Okay. And also, we also know that you can be perfectly normal or considered to be perfectly normal into late age.
Yeah.
And then acquire something in late age that could also push you into a demented state at a faster rate. And right. I say that because with later age, our aging process has now diminished our bodies to be able to maintain the homeostatic balance in check as well as we did when we were younger.
Also weakened immune system.
The weakened immune system, immunosenescence, the inability now to actually adjust to your environment as well as we did when we were younger.
Right.
That could be then, for instance, it could be that you're now slowing down in your activities. You're not walking as much. You're not as active as much. You're
right.
You're more sedentary. That could actually be giving you that increased risk. Your diet may change. Your gut microbiota may change. We don't know these things of how this is actually occurring when we age into old age. So this makes an understanding of really why these are occurring, why dementias are actually manifesting at a point in time a lot more difficult to understand. We can do profiling of individuals. We can do genetic profiling. We can do, analysis of diet. We can do certain things of that nature. As we move into the future, we're going to be doing more personalized medicine for everybody. And I think we're going to need that because every individual is a little different.
Right.
That will help us understand how what our bodies are doing at points in time. And how different environments may be influencing our bodies at those points in time as well. So there are some common things that we need to look at, though. I think I'm convinced that there are certain infectious components to many of these neurodegenerative processes that we've never given credit to up to this point that can come on board or be on board throughout your life and manifest at a different point in time, especially with aging. Because now our bodies are not capable of dealing with what's on board as well as we could when we're younger.
Yeah.
Just because of how our bodies metabolize, the cells can adjust or not adjust, our adaptability, I guess we could look at there. And we're losing that adaptability in older age. Obviously, we're finite organisms.
Yeah.
There is an endpoint for every biological organism.
Yep.
And we're not sure how that also can play in. It's almost like saying, okay, well, at 120 you stop. Well, potentially there are people that have gone beyond that actually. But what does that mean for us as far as what's happening along the way? Okay, and it could be that those people actually aged at a slower rate, or actually, had gene replications that were more efficient, or detoxification events that were more efficient to be able to get to that point in time. But even then, I mean, we do have a finiteness to.
Well, maybe you do, Dr. Balin. I plan on being here indefinitely.
So do I, but...
So what do you think is the most beneficial activity for someone with dementia that could potentially slow the progression of that dementia? I know that once we get to more aggressive stages of Alzheimer's and other dementias, it is degenerative by nature and there's almost no slowing that down. But what could, like, let's say for someone who's early dementia or even just MCI, mild cognitive impairment, to slow that progression down? What's a really good activity?
It's a good question.
Hey.
What's a good activity? Well, being active is a good activity of doing anything. Maintaining socialization. Yep. I would say that as well. Maintaining any type of intellectual stimulus as well. That you want to keep. It's almost like continual learning. You want to keep your brain working that way. Okay, so instead of just saying, oh, well, you have a diagnosis of dementia, it's time to shut down completely. No. It's time to keep going, actually. By doing that, you can probably modulate, depending on the individual, the progressiveness of that particular problem. Of course, it will vary from person to person.
Right.
There's no exact formula here or template to follow. But I would say doing that. Also, maintaining a healthy diet. Maintaining and that is a big key.
Yeah.
Because in your diet, if you have anti-inflammatories, if you have antioxidant molecules, if you have ways of maintaining the nutrition capability, so you're maintaining maximum metabolic ability in your body, will also be maintained throughout. So it's going to affect the brain as well as other parts of the body. And I think that can minimize the progressiveness. It doesn't necessarily change that. Until we find real causation, are we going to be able to say, okay, I will treat for this.
Yes.
And hopefully everything else is added in that you could now stop something even at a point in time where something has begun or you've been diagnosed with dementia, where you could stop it at that point so you don't progress beyond.
Right.
Okay, that would be the ideal if someone now has already had the diagnosis. But prior to diagnosis, for us, where we believe we're normal. Hopefully we are.
Maybe you are. I don't know about myself.
We need to maintain, okay, what do we do? Maintain our proper diet or what we believe would be the best diet.
Right.
Activity, okay? Keep staying mentally active. Keep reading, keep investigating, keep doing the things that we have been doing to actually now in a continuum. It's not a panacea. It's not something that would totally eliminate, going on to getting or developing a dementia necessarily, but it certainly is helping at a point in time where you're not demented prior to hopefully not going down that path.
Right. I mean, we've always said on this show that there's no one cure-all for every single disease. There's not even a cure-all for a single disease. We've talked about in the past the overprescription of antibiotics. When Dr. Goldstein was on, we were talking about the overprescription of pain medications. It seems as though keeping a good balance of things, not just, you mentioned antioxidants before, and I remember a paper recently that came out that said too much antioxidants over a long period of time is actually detrimental to the body. And you were just saying that there's a cleanup process.
Yes.
And if we overtax that cleanup process, that's what's going to cause some of the problems. So when we have these issues, it's very difficult, I guess, as Americans, for us to not have that binary answer, that black and white. This is what you do. This isn't what you do.
Right.
So how do we deal with that for patients, for potential patients, for people who are dealing with this situation?
Okay, so I think an approach to take is in the evaluation of an individual that is now being diagnosed with dementia.
Yeah.
Is an evaluation of what have they done in life? What are their interests? What have they? What was the work they did? What were their interests? What is their environment, etc. And what I think we want to do is try to put them into a plan where they can maintain the things they really like to do in their life that they have been doing.
Yeah.
Okay. Improve upon things like nutrition if you need to. It could be that you don't, but if you do need to. Improve upon, exercise level if you need to. Okay. Improve upon things like doing social activities. Go to a museum. Go to the Franklin Institute. Go to the art museum.
Yep.
Do things that are stimulating. But that maintenance of activity, I think, is key. Okay, and to sort of like, refresh also memories of your environment, of the people around you, of your loved ones. Just look at pictures, look at albums of that nature. Visit your loved ones, visit friends. Get people involved with you so that you're normalizing your situation versus abnormalizing it.
Right.
In that sense, to me, that's the key, is to get those people and maintain the normalcy as much as possible.
So, let me think how I want to phrase this one. It's not going to be a curveball, I promise.
A slider, maybe.
Could you potentially? Could you describe for us the idea of the blood-brain barrier for a moment? And I do have a point to this, I promise.
Okay.
So could you describe for us how important the blood-brain barrier is to the brain exactly?
Okay, the blood-brain barrier is a requirement to have in our nervous system, in the central nervous system. It was designed and is designed in a way that you have the vessels, the endothelial cells making up the vessels for the vast majority of the brain. There are some areas where this doesn't happen, but for the vast majority of the brain, those cells have junctional complexes that make sure that blood can't leak into the brain and fluid in the brain can't leak back into the blood vessel. Okay. That's the level of the blood-brain barrier. Now, obviously, blood is flowing into the brain in arteries, goes to arterioles, it goes to capillaries, it goes to venules, it goes to veins, and it drains out of the brain as well. Okay, and we have different venous systems in the brain to allow for this drainage. So it's a circulation that we have in the brain. These vessels that are in the brain, though, have these junctions, tight junctions, to prevent leakage for the most part. You can get transport through the endothelial cells, it's like saying I'm going to go through a cell from one side to the other, from the blood side to the brain, and also you can go from the brain to the blood side, going through the cell though. So you have to go through the cell. The barrier part of this is to function that way, but also to function so you're not letting things in the blood, toxins, infectious agents, elements in the blood of even too many white blood cells, to get into the brain in a very ready fashion. You need to have a blockade, and basically this acts as a blockade. It is not a foolproof or an absolute blockade, however. It can be manipulated. It can be manipulated based on the status of whatever's in the bloodstream.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so it is a protective mechanism. And it was used to be thought years ago that it gave you a level of immune protection so that your systemic immune response,
Mm-hmm.
your inflammatory response in the bloodstream, etc., could not affect the brain directly. Well, we now know that that is not an absolute system, and that there are times where molecules in the bloodstream, some toxins,
Mm-hmm.
some infectious agents, even white blood cells, even chemicals that white blood cells make, what we call cytokines, inflammatory molecules, can have an influence on the blood-brain barrier, leading to a leakiness of it. And so you can get entry through the blood-brain barrier at times into regions of the brain that could lead to then some type of deficit in the brain. Mm-hmm. You could also have different levels of vascular damage due to strokes, where you could have a blood clot that formed in the vessel in the brain, leading to now blockage of flow, leading to then the brain, leading to an infarct, what we call damage around that area where the blood should be going and oxygenating the tissue, but now no longer doing that. Okay, so that can then lead to deficit as well. You could have bleeds in the brain where a blood vessel bursts, like an aneurysm. And now you have leakage, and now a larger area of damage in the brain because now blood is now flowing into the brain cells and proper, damaging them, basically. It's leading to now a significant loss of those cells being able to function properly. So this blood-brain barrier is a key component to maintaining health. Mm-hmm. As we age, because our vessels cannot start to undergo change, they can become more rigid. Mm-hmm. You could have atherosclerosis developing in the vessels, where lipid deposits in the vessels. That can happen in the brain as well. It leads to increased risk of what could happen to your blood-brain barrier. It could be now more fragile. So it could open more readily. You could have a stroke more readily. You could have a bleed more regularly, or in a more dramatic fashion. Mm-hmm. So these types of things can happen. In the middle of the brain, where we call the endocrine brain, in the third ventricle region, where you have cerebrospinal fluid made in the middle of the brain in what we call ventricles.
Could you describe the ventricles a little bit more for us so that people can understand it a little bit easier?
Sure. Let's see here. Okay.
About this high.
Okay. So I mentioned the middle of the brain. This is what we call the third ventricle area. Mm-hmm. It's actually a space in here, and cerebrospinal fluid is in that space. This is a lateral ventricle, the space in here. And cerebrospinal fluid is made in here, but also in here. Mm-hmm. And then flows out. It flows down this way, and then flows up and around the brain, and also flows around the spinal cord.
So what's the main difference between the blood and the cerebrospinal fluid?
Well, the cerebrospinal fluid is considered to be an ultrafiltrate of the blood. So their cells are called choroid plexus that actually make the cerebrospinal fluid. They actually are taking fluid from the blood, water and ions and glucose, and moving them through their cells, and now secreting this material, fluid and ions and glucose, into the space, what we call a ventricle. And we have two lateral ventricles. So this is now the medial surface of the brain. The other half of the brain would be here. Here. So this is the medial surface. So the ventricles, you have these two lateral ventricles. One would be here, and you'd have one on the other side.
Right.
You have one third ventricle. So the two lateral ventricles have an opening that goes into the third ventricle. And then you have what's called the cerebral aqueduct, which is right through here. And then you have a fourth ventricle, which is in here. And then you have movement up and around the brain. This is a cerebellum, and also around the spinal cord. So you have the meninges actually is around your brain to allow for the cerebrospinal fluid now to basically flow up and around the brain and around the spinal cord.
Mm-hmm.
An example of what the cerebrospinal fluid is doing, it's this ultrafiltrate of the blood, so it's a fluid,
Mm-hmm.
has ions and glucose for the most part. It actually now is surrounding the entire nervous system. For the brain typically weighs about 1,250 to 1,300 grams.
Okay.
Okay, it's about 3 pounds or so. Okay, different size. There are different size brains in different individuals, but on average, it's around there. The cerebrospinal fluid now surrounding the brain takes the effective weight of the brain down to 50 grams. So it's a buoyant system.
Mm.
Your brain basically is floating in this system, encased in this bony shell.
Yeah.
Okay, so that now it is now able to withstand trauma if you get hit in the head or you bang your head. Now it's not absolute, obviously, because you could actually damage the brain with a strong enough hit or something, or skull fracture, something of that nature. But because it's doing this, it's not only allowing the brain to be buoyant, but it's also nourishing other parts of the brain, especially the surfaces of the brain. Because all of this fluid now is sort of now there with nutrients in it, some nutrients anyway, that allows for now maintaining normal brain activity. So in essence, the cerebrospinal fluid is something that is originally derived from the blood, but it is that ultrafiltrate. In the center of the brain here too, which I mentioned before, right in here, where you have that third ventricle, this is a real interesting area because it's what we call the endocrine part of the brain. This is where you have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which would be sitting like right in here, and the hypothalamus. So this is an area that creates and makes a lot of hormones. Your hypothalamic releasing hormones. These hormones then go into the bloodstream or go to the pituitary, and then you have activity in the pituitary, which makes a lot of hormones as well. So that affect different aspects of our body. In this area, you don't have a blood-brain barrier. You have what's called the circumventricular organs. And these are the areas where you're making these ingredients that are dumped into the blood. Well, those circumventricular organs actually have leaky vessels. And those leaky vessels allow for the filtrate from blood, like plasma from the blood, to leak up and around the cells that make the cerebrospinal fluid. That's how the fluid actually is getting out of the bloodstream in the third ventricle area and also lateral ventricle areas in order to now allow the choroid plexus epithelial cells to make your cerebrospinal fluid that gets dumped into these ventricular spaces. Now, that's my description of it. It may be hard to visualize the three-dimensionality of that, but it's a needed area for functionality, for proper functionality anyway in our nervous system.
Okay. So you kind of hit the nail right on the head of where I wanted to go, which is I wanted to describe one of the two of the topics that have kind of entered the modern lexicon and the modern attention span very recently. So several years ago, we had the movie Concussion, which was with Will Smith, and I forget the doctor's name, unfortunately, but he characterized CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. How is that different from what we were talking about before in terms of dementia? Because it almost seems like we're getting very close in terms of symptomology between the two.
Yes, and chronic traumatic encephalopathy will increase the risk for now developing a frank dementia. Often Alzheimer's diagnosis of that type of dementia, but it could be other types of dementia as
Right.
well. So with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, you're getting now damage to multiple regions of the brain. Not only the frontal part, it could be the sides, it could be the back of the brain, etc., depending on how you're experiencing your brain being hit. And if it's, from a hockey player to a football player,
Soccer,
the American
baseball.
football, the soccer players,
Yeah.
right, baseball potentially getting hit certain ways, bike riding and falling off and hitting your head. Okay, so there's many different ways that you could actually then lead to a chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Yeah.
But what's seen there is that it is a significant damage in multiple regions of the brain, where now the cells are now under stress. Some of those cells now start to dysfunction. Some can actually start to die. Some could just become dysfunctional, and some pathology will show up in these brains. A lot of the pathology is what we call tau pathology, the tau protein.
Yeah.
The tau protein, and we've talked about this a little bit with Alzheimer's disease in the
Right.
past, because it forms neurofibrillary tangles in Alzheimer's disease. In chronic traumatic encephalopathy, often the tau protein, which is in nerve cells, and it's typically a protein that actually cross-links or binds a microtubule or microtubules together. Like microtubules can be thought of as railroad tracks
Yep.
in an axon, and you need to now have the cross pieces of the railroad tracks. This is where the tau protein comes in. When you have damage to those cells, the tau protein loses its ability to cross-link and now becomes unlinked, and actually, before it becomes insoluble, it's soluble. If your nerve cells now become damaged where the membranes break open, the tau protein can leak out. And that's what happens in chronic traumatic encephalopathy often, and these tau proteins start leaking out into the cerebral spinal fluid, and they start accumulating on the surfaces of the brain.
Yeah.
And you can find them on different regions of the brain, from the frontal cortex, to the temporal. Here, I have another. Let's bring this out. From the frontal regions, temporal regions, even occipital regions. And the surface, when you look at the histology, you can see tau proteins like aggregating in these regions. You can also see the beta amyloid peptides accumulate, which is at times, also indicative of Alzheimer's disease. So it's telling us that there's significant cellular damage
Right.
that's occurred in these brains. Now, it doesn't lead to a dementia early on necessarily, but it can lead to the dementia as the people age and go into older age.
I see.
Some of these people have such severe deficit, though, that it is warping their thinking ability. A number of them suffer from significant depression, anxiety, paranoia, and a number of people actually have taken their lives that have suffered severe chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Right. I believe one of the symptoms is an ease to become combative in terms of behavior.
Yes, and it's because of damage in different regions of the brain. So here's a perspective. There was an analysis recent up in Boston of individuals that had chronic traumatic encephalopathy and died, and their brains were analyzed.
Right.
Of the 300, so what they did was they took brains, though, from even individuals that didn't express chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Okay, and they and these were, I believe, from NFL players,
Right.
the National Football League players. There were 376 brains analyzed. Of the 376, 356 had evidence of chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Oof.
Like a huge number here
Yeah.
of individuals of that grouping. So the vast majority are actually suffering from that problem
Yeah.
due to continual trauma,
Yeah.
and the activity of how their heads are being hit, the brain is being affected, etc.
Right.
So it suggests then that these types of sports, unfortunately, are leading to severe deficit in that population.
It is a shame because it's, if I remember correctly, one of the difficulties, especially when it comes to dementia of any kind, is the ease that we have in terms of diagnosis is usually post-mortem. And when I say that, and one of the major reasons why I enjoy the movie Concussion is because they actually show the process of fixing the brain.
Uh-huh.
Which is not necessarily something that we do very often in a medical or a forensic sense these days. We don't necessarily find it a requirement anymore. But part of that is you have to almost want to have to do that in order to get to that point. Do we need a better way of diagnosing this, or should we start putting some of these individuals with pasts of playing all of these sports on almost like a watch in a way?
Well, we do need to have better monitoring of the individuals that are suffering from any kind of concussive type of hit or injury. It is much better than it ever used to be.
Yeah.
It's not foolproof now, however, but for instance, every person that's going to play football probably should have a pre-diagnosis, but unfortunately, some of these individuals have been playing football from pee-wee days through all of their school years, through college, into the pros, so they already may have, by the time they get to a pro football team, they may have chronic traumatic encephalopathy issues. There's brain damage that probably is there. So at some level, either at a younger age or when you're going into a pro sport like that, you need to have some level of pre-monitoring, some way of saying, okay, what's on board? What do you have? You could do neuropsych testing, you could do imaging, you could do CSF analysis, for instance, to cerebrospinal fluid analysis to determine, are there any inflammatory markers, for instance, present? Is there any level of these proteins that would show up if you have damage in the nervous system? To give you a baseline. And then to follow these individuals if they go into these sports, knowing the risk that this could happen, and following them along the way. And if there's a concussion, for instance, now they have to be retested, and you have to determine, okay, what's really happening here in the central nervous system.
Right.
And just doing basic neuropsych testing may not be enough. It helps, but it may not be enough. And then you have to determine what level of time does a person really have to now stop this activity to allow for recovery. And
I have to agree with one of our audience members. Education might be one of the biggest things here for the players. It's not just this boogeyman that's sitting there behind their shoulder. You're going to get CTE one day. It's more, we can do some things to help you now that could protect you later, that could make it so that you will have a better cognitive health downstream. They enjoy this. This is a passion for them. You and I, we have a passion for science. There's dangers in what we do. In the past, I've seen some very dangerous situations that people have gotten themselves into, and they've gotten seriously injured because of it. And that goes the same way for sports. You can have people that get these very serious injuries, and it's almost like the consequences are outweighing their love of it.
It's true. And going into it, they're not thinking about the consequences
Correct.
often. Okay, they need to, but it's not the typical.
Mm-hmm.
Some, as we've seen over the years, and more recently, young players actually have decided, I'm hanging this up. I'm not going to do this anymore,
Right.
because I don't want this as an outcome.
Correct.
Okay, they're opting that way.
Mm-hmm.
They opt that way for a number of reasons. One is a concussion issue and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Another
Yes.
is a lot of times they're getting such severe damage to the rest of the body.
Mm-hmm.
They're ending up crippled in late age because their knees have been shot, and
Right.
they've had too many ACL tears or
Mm-hmm.
hip injuries, et cetera, et cetera. So these are issues that are showing up later on that the player at 20 years of age
Mm-hmm.
is not thinking about, that when I get to 70, I won't be able to walk or think. And that's a problem.
I'm very surprised because only recently did I get back into it, and I've been watching several videos on it. Professional wrestling, as it is, so wrestling entertainment. They take some pretty heavy hits, and I mean heavy hits. Boxers too, MMA fighters. These gentlemen and ladies that go through this, they take some pretty heavy poundings, and it almost makes you wonder why we haven't seen it become way more public in those. We've only really seen it in football, recently at least. It makes me wonder about them because some of the wrestlers that were there when I was a younger child, they're now having major health issues in life. So I mean, it goes to the chronic diseases of aging issue. Do we need better education as a whole? Do we need better treatment? Do we need better diagnostic processes? What do we need to do? Or is it a combination of all of it?
Well, I think it's a combination of all of it. By the way, when you're talking about the boxers and the MMA fighters and everything, dementia pugilistica is a defined entity. Muhammad Ali had that. It led to Parkinsonism with Muhammad Ali, but also his ability to speak was affected, his motion was affected, etc. And basically, there's enough brain damage in the boxers' brains that you can become demented. You can have multiple deficit, as Ali showed, but others have shown as well over the years.
Yeah.
Okay. And those individuals obviously have significant brain trauma. They will continue to. So all of these people going into these activities, there is great risk that they will have some type of dementia as they age if they live into longer life.
Yeah.
The other part of that is living to longer life because of other ailments that can show up along the way, because their bodies are taking quite a beating that can have other deficits to it as well. So the education part, yes, but one of the problems though with some of these sports though is that there's so much money involved.
Yeah.
That it goes to, well, I want to make my $100 million, and not thinking that, well, it won't matter how much money you have when you're demented.
You had the same thought as our
you will
audience
not be able to do anything with that. Okay,
Yeah,
so
that's
you
true.
might make it up front, but guess what? Your quality of life is going to be diminished.
Right.
And it's just, this is just an outcome. Okay, so telling you this when you're 20 years of age, when you want to do this, okay, they may not digest it the same way.
Correct.
Okay. Even with older players that now have experienced it, going back and telling the younger players, look, this is your risk. You're going to become more like me if you continue to do this.
Right.
And do you want to take the risk? And then it becomes a personal choice, basically, right?
Right.
I mean, but there's so much money involved that it is such an enticement. It's like, I'll do something at this point in time and enjoy my life because I don't know what tomorrow will bring.
Yeah.
That type of an approach versus, well, you might live into old age, but you may be in then a nursing facility or a memory care center for years because your outcome might be that.
It's funny that you mentioned Muhammad Ali because I was watching a breakdown of several of his fights, and if I remember correctly, the commentator was saying that he would always get very close to his opponent, which made the opponent's punches come to the occipital region of the brain, the very back and sometimes lower portion of the brain. And if you bring out your prop there of the brain, you're looking at the cerebellum. Yes. You're looking at the brainstem. You're looking at the pons.
Yeah. So what Joe is talking about is here's the cerebellum. Here's the brain stem from this level here. In here, the pons, the medulla. Here's the midbrain area.
Yep.
And there, all of this. Here's the occipital region.
All of these are and some of the hits that he took was also around the motor cortex region, the sensory cortex region. It's very interesting when you look at these hits, and they were doing a zoom in on a computer generated image, and they were showing some of the regions of impact that he was taking.
Yes, in fact, if you look in the center of the brain, where the ventricles are located.
Yep.
I don't know. I'll show this, but I don't know if it'll be able to be visualized. Right here, these little blue areas in the brain are the ventricles. Okay. In Muhammad Ali, they became extremely dilated, so they actually widened very significantly. When that happens, you have an accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid. It's almost like developing hydrocephalus. And you get what's called hydrocephalus ex vacuo. And by doing that, all of the tissue around these areas, if these become widened, become much larger, all of this tissue is then impacted. And because in the middle of the brain, you also have what are called the basal ganglia, where the basal ganglia are very involved with motor activity. And the ventricles are right next to that. If they enlarge, they impact the basal ganglia, which now impacts motor activity and also cognitive activity as well. So that's why when you get that enlargement happening, you're actually damaging the brain from the inside of the brain out, which is phenomenal as well.
Yeah, that was one of the I don't want to say the scary parts, but in a way it is rather scary. The level of damage that is done to the brain just from those impacts. And one of the best examples that I saw was in, again, that movie Concussion, where he put a tennis ball into a jar and put just a small amount of water in it just to barely cover the tennis ball, and then he shook it repeatedly. And it's like, this is what's happening to your brain.
Correct.
It reminds me of those commercials from the early 90s. This is your brain on drugs.
And what's interesting is when you get your brain sloshing that way, what will happen is, because you have a bony container, inside the bony container, there are sharp ridges. And when your brain now is going forward and then backwards, okay, you're damaging both the frontal and the back part of the brain, because you're hitting the bone. It's actually squishing your cerebral spinal fluid away, so now the brain proper is hitting a hard surface. And you keep hitting the hard surface, front and back, boom, you're going to have damage.
And this is why people see stars when they fall backwards sometimes.
Correct. And so you get different types of injuries called coup and contra coup injuries. Like if you fell backwards, you hit here, but your brain goes forward and hits the front. So now you have a coup and a contra coup injury, which leads to significant bruising of the brain, literally brain damage. But depending on the extent of that, it can be now temporary or more permanent, depending on how much you're getting hit and how often that would happen.
So the next thing, and I'm very glad that you mentioned this traumatic experience that the brain can go under. I want to talk a little bit about traumatic brain injuries. So we in the scientific community refer to these as TBIs, which is literally just traumatic brain injury. What constitutes as a traumatic brain injury versus, let's say, a concussion? Or is a concussion a type of traumatic brain injury?
A concussion is actually a type of traumatic brain injury, and you could have many different types of traumatic brain injuries. I mean, you could have a skull fracture, for instance. That would lead to a traumatic brain injury.
Yep.
You could be in a car accident and hit your head in the windshield, for instance, and have a traumatic brain injury. You could have somebody that punched you in the jaw and your head turned quickly this way. You could have a shearing force injury where you're actually, because of the force and your head turning so quickly and the brain turning so quickly, it can actually shear some of the nerve connections from cells to cell. So you can have now these diffuse, what are called diffuse axonal injuries that are extremely dangerous, because you're now losing your connectivity of one nerve cell to another nerve cell. For instance, it's like taking a telephone pole, two telephone poles, and the wire between. And now all of a sudden you're taking one of the poles and knocking it down, and it's pulling on the wire.
Yeah.
It's literally shearing from one pole to the other.
Right.
Like that can actually happen in the brain the same way. Okay, so all of these, any type of severe insult to the head could lead to a traumatic brain injury. And also the internal stuff. We don't think of a stroke, for instance, as necessarily a traumatic brain injury, but it is. Okay, or could be, depending on the extent of the stroke.
Right.
For instance, if it was in the motor cortex of the brain, there is some type of clot or bleed in the motor cortex and the blood vessels internally in the brain. It could damage enough of the motor cortex that you've lost movement on one side of the body. So it's a traumatic brain injury.
Right.
Okay. And then depending on the extent of it, and the recovery is questionable. How do you recover from it?
Right.
Some of these you can recover from. Some can be more permanent loss that you won't recover from because the brain cannot adapt. And again, it depends on the injury.
And I mean, whenever a lot of times whenever we discuss traumatic brain injuries, a lot of times the military comes up.
Yes,
But like we were saying, it's concussions as well. Traumatic brain injuries are not exclusive to the military. You can have a traumatic brain injury, like you said, from when you're younger. You could be just someone could have knocked you over in a bar and you might have hit the pole.
Correct.
You could have, fell out of bed and hit your head on something and not even realized it until you hit the floor. So it seems as though anybody can have a traumatic brain injury almost on any scale at any point in their life.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I have a friend that just last year was bike riding, fell off was on a mountain trail. He's 70 years old, riding a bike, fell off the bike, hit his head. It dazed him. He had a helmet on, dazed him, didn't think much of it. A few days later, had a headache. It sort of went away, but then it came back. And a number of weeks later, he went to see his daughter. He was visiting friends. He went to see his daughter. His daughter said, "Dad, you're complaining of a headache, and you seem to be, kind of, a little cognitively out of it.
Yeah.
I think we should go to the doctor." Okay, the emergency room.
Right.
Took him to the emergency room, and sure enough, he had a subdural hematoma. Okay, from the fall hitting his head. Subdural hematoma is a bleed in right underneath the meninges called the dura of the brain, and this bleed actually happened and it clotted on top of the brain. Okay. And what it did, though, the clot on top of the brain was putting pressure on his brain so that it started affecting how his brain was functioning. It gave him headaches, little cognitive deficit, etc. So he had to actually have it, the clot removed. They had to burr a hole in the skull, take out the clot. The blood vessel had already sealed off. Okay, it's perfectly normal. So he had like the beginnings of brain trauma. That was not permanent, fortunately, but could have been had they not caught that in time.
Right.
Okay. But that's how things like that can happen.
So I guess it goes without saying that if you encounter a situation where you might have had a traumatic brain injury, you should seek some kind of medical attention.
Yes, just not especially if you have symptomatology that is ongoing. Also, if you've had a severe head trauma. And you feel that, oh God, I'm getting tired, I'm losing consciousness, etc., immediate attention is needed.
Yeah.
Okay, because that could be fatal.
Right. So one of the things that I find very interesting about the brain is its ability to adapt. But not only that, it's its innate ability of having multiple backups for every single process. So when we discuss, how dementia is a degenerative aspect, how it's, going down almost a slippery slope, if you will, is that because those backups are kind of getting taken out piece by piece? Those efficiencies are kind of being removed.
It's a way to look at it, yes. Because you can have, while often with dementias, it becomes bilateral, it may not begin that way. So it may begin with one side of the brain a little bit more than the other side of the brain, but there's connectivity to both sides. So eventually that connectivity, because it's to both sides, will affect both sides, especially in dementias in particular. Okay, there can be insults to the brain only affecting one side or the other, but with dementias it usually does involve both. So there is that, the symmetry is being affected.
I see. So it is actually 6:30.
Really?
Yes, I know it goes by quickly whenever you're here, Dr. Balin, and I have to thank you for that. You do make these episodes very enjoyable, so thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I want to give our audience, as always, the time that they can have to gather some final questions.
Okay.
At this point, as always, are there any questions that you have for me, Dr. Balin? Other than please stop bothering me throughout the day.
Not right offhand.
Whenever we discuss these topics of dementia and Alzheimer's and things like that, it always comes with that connotation of negativity. But I think part of what we've discussed tonight is also the fact that it's not just negative. There are some positives. There's a silver lining there at times, and certain things can be done that are small that can actually go a very long way to bettering the health of the patient.
Yes, and that's a take-home message, I think, is that even with that type of diagnosis, the individual is still a person, and we're hoping to keep that status as long as possible. Now, unfortunately, end-stage dementias, you don't think of it that way anymore because the person has been lost.
Yeah.
The identity of the person, their recognition, it becomes more of a shell of an individual, which is the tragedy of these different types of diseases.
Yeah.
And that's why we're motivated to make a difference now.
Right.
So that is not going to be the eventuality for anybody. Okay, that's why we are committed to trying to make a difference now with the research we do, with the education we're doing, with really furthering our understanding of brain functionality, of how do we better educate up front, how do we better diagnose up front, how do we better prevent up front, so we're not facing that.
If I could beg your indulgence a little bit, I know that you visited a community recently.
Yes.
Could you describe what they're doing that's different from what we've seen in the past? Because we all have this idea of what how can I put it, an old folks' home is.
Yes.
How has that, how is this different from what you've seen in the past?
Well, this is a retirement community that has all phases of living there, from independent living to assisted living, nursing care, and also they have a memory care center. And it's a 20-unit memory care center that actually was remarkable. It is a state-of-the-art center. They've designed it so that each individual has their own room, and they are active throughout the day. They have different activities in the center. They designed the center also so that all the rooms, if you open the doors to the rooms, it looks out upon large areas of windows facing out into garden areas. And they said that individuals, when it's warm out, they go out into the garden areas and they can actually either garden or sit there and observe and take part.
Lovely.
So a real active process. They have different types of activity rooms. They have their own dining area. They have their own chef. They have their own kitchen area, etc. They designed this thinking of all the aspects of what living in a community would be like. Almost like an enlarged home.
Yeah.
Where the people are living, and they have all those different rooms they could go to take part in activities. Also, throughout, there are big screen, like television monitors that have activities going on the monitors, where you could even just stare at a monitor and see like kayaking or something, and then another one showing a forest area and animals in the forest, and another one showing flowers in a field of flowers, and they rotate what the screens are and what are showing you. They have a tranquil room. You can go into the room and just sit there, and they have a big screen in there too, and they're playing music on it, and you can lower the blinds, and you can just sit there and meditate if you want to. I mean, so they've thought of all different types of activities a person could engage in, and allowing for the people to be as normal as possible, even though all of them have a dementia. And they call it a memory care center because there may be different dementias ongoing there, not just Alzheimer's.
It seems also that they're trying to make it as benign of a title as possible, because again, it's Alzheimer's ward or the dementia ward, or and that comes with a certain connotation, like you and I have talked about. There is a need to edit or change the vocabulary that we have.
Yeah, and it goes to keeping the environment and the people as what we would classify as normal as possible.
Yeah,
and that's important.
Yep, we're trying to give them as much empathy and individuality as possible.
Yes.
If I may extend one sentiment from our audience member. She says that this was very informative for her, and as a nurse that has worked with dementia patients, she felt that this was great. If I can just extend from myself, and if I may for you, Dr. Balin, as well, thank you very much for being a nurse, Nevermore. We greatly appreciate all of the efforts that you do, and all nurses do. One of the things that I try and tell our med students here is you have to not only rely on the nurses, but you have to trust them as well, as if they are your equals, which they are. And for me personally, I've encountered many situations where the nurse has always seemed to know more about what's going on about the patient than the actual doctor does, but that's because of the level of work that they are finding themselves to do. So we greatly appreciate everything that you do. So thank you very much. Thank you so very much. Dr. Balin, thank you. Thank you very much for coming.
You're welcome.
For sharing with us not only your perspective, but also your knowledge on this topic.
I'm happy to be here.
Greatly appreciate it. For me, I was learning things tonight that I hadn't learned at all. So thank you so very much for it. As always, Dr. Balin, you're welcome on the show at any time. I think at this point, I almost have to call you a co-host at this point.
I feel that way.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. And if I may, I'm going to take us home so that we can get home and enjoy a well-deserved meal. But before I do that, I open the floor to you to say whatever you feel the need to. Tell us about what's going on in the world.
Well, I just want to thank you, Joe, too, for actually hosting this.
Thank you.
And I hope that all the information here can be useful for us, for all of our audience members as well, because we're faced with these issues now that are ever present. We have to look at this in a real way, deal with the situations as they come up, and we are making tremendous strides, even though it may not feel that way at times, but we really are. There's a lot of activity now that's going to make the difference for the future. So I'm extremely hopeful, and I hope everybody else is too.
But as always, Dr. Balin, thank you. And if I may, at the very least, it's informative for me and it's useful for me. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. So let me just take us all home so that we can all enjoy the rest of our day. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I had a ton of fun, and I hope that you did. If you are not already following the channel, please consider following us. If you're already following us, please join our Discord, as that is the best way for you to interact with us. Find out if we're adjusting the schedule, find out what we're doing that day. And also, if you feel so inclined, please feel to subscribe. It does help us. It helps us expand. It helps us provide better content for you, and it allows us to keep doing more for you. So I want to thank you all so much, and so long, everybody, and thanks for all the fish. Bye-bye now.
Bye.